And our next speaker is Dr. Massimo Giuseppetti, Associate Professor of Humanities at Università Roma III, a young university for young people, as it advertises itself. He has written more books in the last 10 years than I have written in the last 50. And he has the good fortune of writing them in Italy, where you could sell books on Bacchylides. He began in archaic Greek poetry. He's done most of his work in archaic Greek poetry. He has recently spread out into theater as well. And he will speak to us on textualization as interpolation, reconsidering repetition in Greek epic poetry.
Thank you much. Thank you very much for your presentation. I am very glad to be together with you in this virtual seminar today, the first day of summer. So I take it as a very good sign, I would say. So let me share my presentation today. I want to consider textualization from the point of view of Greek archaic epic poetry. More specifically, I'm interested in one aspect of epic poetry that appears or has appeared generally problematic, particularly as a result of the complex transition from its oral origins to its written crystallizations, that is, repetition. Repetition is both a hallmark of the epic genre and one conspicuous sign of its presumed difficult adaptation to the written format. Scholars have long suspected of interpolation those passages where the same event or detail seems repeated, apparently in inconsistent or redundant fashion. The common assumption behind such a suspicion is that the interventions of later poets or scribes, by altering the original text, left their traces on the text as we have it. I shall term this type of suspected interpolation interpolated repetition. Repetition is, of course, a very interesting area of investigation in itself, and its specific Homeric version has attracted different specialists in recent years. Today, however, my focus is more restricted. I intend to trace part of the path that has created over the years and decades a place for the idea of interpolated repetition in current criticism. After that, I shall consider some new perspectives on this subject that have emerged over the last decades. Now, I have chosen the German scholar Gottfried Hermann as the founding father, so to speak, of the modern analytical approach to the interpolated repetition. Now, Hermann's premise was that Homeric poetry had its root in a culture that had not rediscovered yet writing. In such a culture, the epic poet often repeated concepts and images because they were convenient, both from the point of view of the composer as from that of the listener. In this category, the convenient repetitions, he placed, for instance, the Homeric rhetoric of self-gloss. For example, the one we find in Iliad 8. Here, the relative clause at line 528 is nothing but a gloss on the adjective at the end of the previous line, keresiforetus. Unlike other Homerists, Hermann had nothing to object to this kind of repetition. Conversely, he found that several passages where the supposed repetition of the content was more marked were, in his opinion, clearly interpolated, for they betrayed that more poets and rhapsodes might have been at work behind the text transmitted by the manuscript. Similes, in his opinion, were particularly prone to this type of interpolation. One of his examples is from Iliad 19, a very well-known passage. Here, he found it hardly believable that the same poet might have compared Achilles' shield first to the moon and right after to a fierce fire. His conclusion was that our text was the composite result of what two different poets have written, or at least composed, each unaware of the other. Thus, the analytical approach to Homeric repetition, on one hand, acknowledged that repetition was crucial to the epic genre, but at the same time was always on the lookout, so to speak, for longer instances of repeated content, where interpolation may be more easily detected. As we have seen, Hermann placed particular emphasis on similes, as the passages critically exposed to interpolated repetition. His approach was later developed by Friedlander, who argued that this kind of interpolation was considerably more common than Hermann had envisaged. In his 1849 article, he listed dozens of passages affected by this problem. His approach was daring in several respects, as he cut passages in 2 or 3 parts, sometimes rewriting whole lines to reconstruct what, in his opinion, were the different versions amalgamated by the scribes. Now, if I spend some time into the early development of modern views of interpolated repetition, it's not because I am convinced that the solution to a scholarly problem lies in its origins. What I am more interested in is the fact that the interpolated repetition represents part of our inherited conglomerate, as Dodds would put it, as readers and interpreters of Homer. Reflecting on such a conglomerate may allow us to see it in a different light. It invites us to analyze and thus defamiliarize its assumption and its implication. In 1949, exactly one century after Friedlander's article, Günther Jachmann wrote that similes, again, are particularly prone to interpolation in terms that follow quite closely what Hermann wrote. More specifically, he noted that many Homeric similes were indeed too good for their context, für die Umgebung zu gut, and that they were a cheap resource for mediocre poets. He speaks of similes as poetisches Freigut. Now, this passage is striking in several respects. Not only does it make a clear-cut distinction between good and bad poets, but it is also permeated by a not too timid despise for similes, precisely quasimiles. The prejudice was clearly that since similes did not narrate, but merely decorate, they could not be considered as essential or as deeply relevant to the construction of epic narrative. Similar stance was taken by Carlo Ferdinando Russo in his commentary on the Hesiodic Shield. And this is the text I want to focus a little bit now. Both Jachmann and Russo found that the description of the faithful night in which Heracles and Iphicles were conceived, line 35-47 of the Shield, were problematic because of its redundant descriptions. Jachmann agreed with Schwarz that line 42-45 were a Zusatzinterpolation. It is an interpolation that supplements the original text. The original text in this case was line 39-41, and the supplemented text was line 42-45. Russo agreed that the passage was interpolated, but he thought that it was in fact an Ersatzinterpolation. That is, line 42-45 were composed as an alternative to lines 39-41. According to Russo, later rhapsodes found that the association of Amphitryon's sheep and slaves with his barely containable desire for his wife Alcmene unacceptable. As a consequence, they came up with a different version, which was then incorporated into the text of the Shield. Now, time forbids me to discuss at length this passage. I shall make only a short remark. Rousseau objected that the two versions were irreconcilable because line 42-45 merely describe Amphitryon's happiness for being back home, whereas the pathos, the desire of line 41 is all about the hero and his wife's night of lovemaking. The phrase aspasios tephilos, however, gladly and happily, the one I underscored in blue, line 45, gladly and happily, however, does sound perfectly apt to introduce the gifts of Aphrodite at lines 46 and 47. Furthermore, and in a very rather different sense, it is also very tempting to consider the length and the effects of duplication given by these lines as something intentional, at least in part, especially if we consider that we are dealing with the double conception of two heroes, that is Heracles and Iphicles. Unfortunately, this is an effect that we can bring into play only in this very particular passage. However, this passage does allow me to move your attention to a dimension that is generally rarely taken into account. The passage from the Shield invites us to consider whether the narrative context may be related to its peculiar expressive features, whether, in other words, the descriptive repetition in this case maps onto the repeated seduction of Alcmene that is taking place in the text. The problem, if we want to broaden the scope, is one of context. Indeed, in what context do our supposedly interpolated repetitions take place? The answer to this question brings us to the models of textualization in current scholarship. More specifically, we are talking about the models of Homeric textualization adopted by scholars. Two in particular have enjoyed critical success in recent years: the evolutionary model and the dictation model. According to the evolutionary model proposed by Gregory Nage, Homeric epics gradually crystallized over centuries of oral performance. Increasingly rigid and fixed versions of the poems emerged thanks to the repeated and regulated performances at Panhellenic festivals like the Pannonia and the Panathenaea. In this respect, as Nage puts it, and I quote, there can be textuality, or better, textualization, without written text, end of quote. According to the dictation model, on the other hand, textualization is inextricably linked to an event, so to speak, a specific moment in which a gifted poet has dictated his oral knowledge in order to be memorialized as a written text. Of course, I'm simplifying matters, but just for the sake of my exposition. For that to be possible without writing having influence on the skills of the poet, the dictation event is usually dated to the early phase of the introduction of writing itself. Now, it is not my intention today to disprove or side with either model. What is more interesting to me now is that in recent years, new insights about the textualizations process have come from ethnographic research, and some of them have been quoted in the paper delivered this morning and this afternoon. The studies of Jonathan Reedy are extremely valuable in this area, and what follows draws much from his work. Two key concepts here are provided by the German terms Verschriftung and Verschriftlichung. The first denotes the simple transposition from the medium of spoken language to the medium of writing. The second refers, on the other hand, to the transformation of oral speech into a written text. While the first, the transposition, denotes a mere change of medium, as in the transcription of a spoken text, The latter designates the reorientation of spoken discourse according to the forms and, more importantly, the concepts of written text. The difference, or rather the distance between them, depends on several factors. On one end of the scale, we have the total rewriting of oral discourse. On the opposite end, we have an oral utterance, essentially left unedited, so to speak. The heuristic value of this distinction lies in the fact that it makes us bring into play the actors that may have determined such difference. In ethnographic research, one such crucial actor is the collector, that is the person or the institution that motivates or causes the textualization. The part played by the collector always affects the textualization process, not only because they may decide the level of editing necessary to make the text acceptable from their point of view, but also because they create the conditions at which the whole process takes place. In this sense, as Reddy notes, textualization must be understood as emergent. It is not always and everywhere the same. In fact, it never is. Rather, it depends on the immediate context, on collectors and performers interacting with one another at specific points in time, end of quote. Really gives brilliant examples of how this interaction has taken shape in different contexts, with collectors invisibly editing the material they had collected. It also uses comparative evidence to show how the setting devised by the collector often exerts a clear influence on the oral performance itself. The lack of a large and empathetic audience, for instance, tends to demotivate the performer, who may thus produce a shorter and less inspired, so to speak, performance. Conversely, the presence of a large and enthusiastic audience may motivate the performer to produce a longer, more elaborate outcome. Unfortunately, for archaic epic poetry, we lack precisely that kind of detailed contextual evidence that is provided by ethnographic research. We do not have for Homer or Hesiod the paratextual information which abounds, for instance, in scholars' reports on their investigations. In this respect, there remains a large gap between what we know about the textualization process in modern cultures and the scanty data available for the archaic Greek world. There is, however, some sort of contact between these distant fields of research, and I should like to explore this area of contact, of interaction, with an eye to our discussion of the interpolated repetition. One fundamental insight comes from the fact that ethnographic textualizations appears, as we saw, emergent and context dependent. This characterization may have a valuable heuristic dimension if we apply it to the problem of the interpolated repetition. We have seen how different contexts of textualization affect both the oral performance and its transformation in writing. This invites to consider the possibility of interpolated repetition as dependent on the nature of the performance in a new perspective. For here, the relevant context has a multifaceted dimension. We know that in archaic and classical Greece, there was not only one authoritative epic tradition, but several, with Homer and Hesiod representing the main figures, and with other important competitors like Orpheus, Musaeus, or the subgenre of the Homeric hymns. The textualization of each of these traditions must have been a complex process in itself, but it's crucial to take into account that all these traditions flourished more or less in the same milieu, something with which their collectors, in ethnographic sense, with their collectors, competing for similar recognition and status. In this perspective, each interpolated repetition should be assessed both in terms of its own tradition, for instance, in terms of Homeric or Hesiodic corpus, and with respect to its other epic counterparts, for instance, in terms of Homeric versus the Hesiodic corpus. In a study first published in 1997, Luigi Enrico Rossi argued that in the Hesiodic works and days, it was possible to detect large portions of interpolated repetitions, for instance, in the section on winter. He also argued that this section were due to an inherent difference between the Homeric and the Hesiodic tradition. In his view, Homeric poetry was less prone to this type of interpolation because it had been exposed to a longer phase of oral transmission. Hesiod, on the other hand, was born when writing was already beginning to spread. His poetry could be transmitted orally only in a very limited way or for a limited span of time, hence its large interpolations. Of course, other factors could be brought to bear on this kind of argument. For instance, how actually comparable is the phenomenon of interpolated repetition in Homer to that in Hesiod? And did the tradition of performing Hesiodic poetry at the festival of the Musea of Thespiae in Boeotia play any part in how the Hesiodic text became as it is now? Needless to say, I cannot explore here the question of the performance of epic poetry in archaic or classical Greece, but I should like at least to recall Andrew Ford's suggestion that it is very unlikely that the whole Iliad was performed during the most Homeric of Panhellenic festivals, the Panathenaea. If this was not the case, then the role of the Athenian performance tradition on the textualization of Homer would be perhaps less significant than generally reckoned. By way of conclusion, let us go back for a moment to the passage from Hesiod's Shield we discussed earlier. Just a few moments ago, we were asking ourselves what may have been the context in terms of performance and textualization of this peculiar passage. One possible answer is that this passage is an example of one particularly successful textualization, one that possibly enhanced or even enlarged the narrative momentum of this section. A transformation in the sense defined above, designed to bring this Hesiodic short poem to a level at least comparable to that of Homeric poetry. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Giuseppetti. Professor Finkelberg?
Oh, thank you very much for your talk. Very illuminating in my eyes. And it's interesting that the name of Jonathan Reedy has emerged several times during this conference. And I think it's not by chance, because his contribution in the last year to the entire issue of textualization is enormous, I think. And the article to which you refer is especially important by introducing, I think, side by side with a poet and a scribe, by introducing a third element or a third factor, his collector, textualizer, or whatever it can be called, and thus Reedy and now you return actually or reconstruct a much more complex picture of turning oral messages or oral performances into text, because the picture we had before, I think, was rather simplistic. Or the old autographic model, the poet wrote himself whatever he composed, or just the poet dictated and the scribe wrote down. But the context, historical context, whatever we know of the comparative evidence, etc., shows that the real picture must have been much more complicated. And I think you have managed to show this in your presentation. And incidentally, I would like to mention that I was one of the readers of Reedy's paper for TAPA, I think, and has admired it since then. Thank you for your paper.
Thank you very much. Yes, what I liked very much about Reedy's paper is that it is a very soft paper. I mean, it doesn't just say that what we see in ethnographic scholarship can be simply applied to Homeric scholarship. He posits a difference, a distance between ethnographic research and Homeric scholarship, and he negotiated the possible interaction between these fields. So in this respect, I followed his example. So my paper is tentative. I don't have very strong conclusion. I think it's more important, at least at this moment, to explore different avenues there to consider several possibilities, several contexts, several scenarios also of interaction between performance, actors, different actors at play in the textualization of Homeric poetry. Thank you very much.